The message came through at 11:23 on a Thursday morning while I was between patients, standing at the nurse's station on the third floor with a half-eaten granola bar in my hand and a chart open on the computer in front of me. It was a balance alert from my bank, the kind I had set to trigger whenever a transaction over $500 hit the account. The number on my screen said $68,440 had been transferred out. I read it the way you read something you already understand, but your brain refuses to process, word by word, digit by digit. Like if I went slowly enough, it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. It didn't. I stood there for a moment, the granola bar still in my hand, the chart still open, the hallway still loud around me, and I thought about the fact that I had a patient in room 312 who needed me in 4 minutes. So I finished the granola bar. I washed my hands. I went to room 312, and I saved the falling apart for later. My name is Cassandra. Everyone calls me Cass. I'm 29 years old. I'm a nurse practitioner at a regional hospital in Columbus, Ohio, and I have spent the last 6 years working night shifts, picking up extra weekend rotations, and saying no to things I wanted so I could say yes to the thing I actually wanted, which was a future that belonged entirely to me. $68,000 was supposed to be that future. It was 5 years of discipline packed into one account. It was a down payment on a condo I had already walked through twice. It was the number I had been staring at every Sunday morning when I checked my banking app the way other people check their horoscope. And on a Thursday in October, while I was on hour 9 of a 12-hour shift, it was gone. Let me tell you about my brother Derek before I tell you the rest, because the money is only part of the story. The larger story starts much earlier, and understanding it is the only way any of this makes sense. Derek is 4 years older than me. He is the kind of person who can walk into a room and make everyone feel like they have been waiting for him to arrive. He has a laugh that sounds like it belongs in a movie, and a handshake that makes older men trust him immediately. He has never, in all the years I've been watching him, finished anything he started. There is a pattern if you know to look for it. He starts things loudly. He talks about them in a way that makes you feel like you are being let in on something important, something big, something that is about to change everything. And then quietly, without announcement, without apology, the thing disappears. The landscape business he launched when he was 26. The food truck concept he spent 8 months pitching to investors. The app for real estate agents that he described to me in detail at Thanksgiving 3 years ago, and that I have never heard mentioned since. Each one arrives with the same energy and leaves with the same silence. What replaces them is a different kind of conversation. The kind that starts with my mother calling to say Derek is going through a rough patch, that things are tight right now, that he just needs a little help to get back on his feet. That family looks out for family, doesn't it? And I've always been the stable one, the smart one, the one who figured it out. My mother says this last part like it's a compliment, and I have spent most of my adult life learning to hear it for what it actually is. I gave money to Derek 4 times over the course of 7 years. Never a huge amount, 300 here, 800 there. Once, after his second venture collapsed, $2,200 that he said he needed to cover a gap in his rent before a check cleared. He paid back part of it. He paid back the kind of amount that keeps you from being able to say he never paid you back at all. I understood later that this was strategic, even if it wasn't conscious. You give back just enough to reset the clock, just enough to keep the relationship functional for the next ask. 3 years ago, I stopped. Not with a confrontation, not with a speech. I just started having a different answer. I'm in a tight spot myself right now. My hours got cut. I'm dealing with some of my own expenses. None of it was true, exactly, but none of it was owed to them either. The asks slowed down. I thought the pattern had finally run its course. I thought we had arrived at a version of our family where I could be present without being extracted. I was wrong about that. What I didn't know, when I was building my savings and telling myself the hard years were behind me, was that Derek had started something new. He called it a private investment opportunity. He had been talking about it in the family the way he talks about everything, with energy and confidence and enough specific-sounding language to make the details feel real without actually being verifiable. He had some investors already, he said. He had a partner with connections. He had a meeting in Chicago in November that was going to change the trajectory entirely. My mother believed him. My mother has always believed him, not because she is a foolish woman, but because believing Derek costs her less than not believing him. Disbelief means conflict. Disbelief means Derek pulling away. And my mother would rather absorb the cost than sit with that. I've known this about her for a long time. I had accounted for it in the small, quiet ways I protected myself. What I had not accounted for was that she would help him reach past my protections. The conference was in Cincinnati, 3 days, for a nursing leadership summit that my hospital sponsored me to attend. I drove down on a Wednesday morning with a suitcase and a schedule, and the particular satisfaction of someone who has just reached a professional milestone they have been working toward for 2 years. I was supposed to be gone until Friday evening. I had set the balance alert before I left the way I always did when I was traveling, a habit I picked up years ago for practical reasons that had nothing to do with my family. What I pieced together later, from bank records and from a conversation with my mother that I will get to, is that Derek called her on Wednesday evening. He told her that he was in a situation, that one of his investors had pulled out and he had a payment due to a supplier by Friday, or the whole arrangement was going to collapse. He needed access to liquid funds, just temporarily, just to bridge the gap until he could restructure. He told her he had tried his own accounts, and the timing didn't work. He told her the amount he needed was $60,000, and that he would have it back in 2 weeks, 3 at the most. My mother could not cover that from her own accounts. She knew it, and Derek knew it. What she had, and what Derek knew she had, was my phone number and the fact that I had added her as an emergency contact on my accounts 2 years earlier, after a health scare that turned out to be nothing but that had genuinely frightened both of us. She had limited access. She had been added for a specific purpose. She had never used it for anything. Until Thursday morning at 9:14, when she used it to authorize a transfer of $68,440 from my savings account to a routing number that I had never seen. She called me at 9:47. I did not pick up because I was in a session. She did not leave a voicemail. At 11:23, the balance alert hit my phone. At 12:08, I called her back from a quiet hallway after my shift ended. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Tell me about my account." There was a pause that I had felt before in other forms, the pause that means the story is being selected, the version being chosen. She said she could explain everything. She said Derek had come to her in a very serious situation. She said the word serious the way she says it, when she means that the consequences are real, but somehow aren't her fault. She said he had needed access to some funds on a time-sensitive basis, and that she had known where to find them, and that she had made the decision because she believed in his ability to pay it back. I asked her if she had used my emergency access to move $68,000 from my account to fund Derek's investment project. She said, "When you put it like that, it sounds different than it was." I told her I was going to need her to tell me exactly where the money went. She gave me the name of an account she described as Derek's business account. She said he would be in touch. She said this was a short-term situation and that she hoped I could be patient with the process. She said I was always so level-headed, which was her way of saying she expected me to absorb this without resistance. I told her I needed the full transfer details and that I would be in touch with the bank. She said she hoped we could handle this as a family. I said I understood. I ended the call and I sat in the parking garage of the Cincinnati Conference Center for a long time. Not because I didn't know what to do, I knew exactly what to do. I sat there because I was doing the math on something I had spent years not wanting to add up. The amount of access I had given, the amount of trust I had maintained, despite everything I knew. The precise, specific way my mother had walked into the space I had left open for an emergency and used it for something I would never have chosen. I was not surprised. That was the part I had to sit with. I was not surprised at all. I called the bank from the parking garage. I reported the unauthorized transfer and opened a fraud investigation. The representative confirmed that while the access had been technically authorized through the emergency permission, the transfer itself had not been made by me and had not been communicated to me in advance. She told me a hold could be placed, that an investigation timeline would begin, and that documentation of my emergency access terms and the nature of the authorization would be relevant. I said yes to everything. I asked for the case number and I wrote it in the notes app on my phone because my hands were not steady enough to find paper. Then I drove back to the hotel and I sat at the small desk in my room and I did 3 things. I called a lawyer. I found her the way you find things when you need them on a Thursday night and don't know where to start, through a bar association referral service for civil litigation attorneys in Ohio. Her name was Margaret, and she had a message that said she returned calls within 4 hours for new client inquiries. She called me back in 2. I told her everything, in the order it happened, as clearly as I could. She told me to send the transfer documentation, the terms of the emergency access agreement, and anything in writing I had from my mother or brother. She told me she would look at it in the morning. The second thing I did was text my younger sister, Nadia. Nadia is 26. She works in graphic design, she lives in Pittsburgh, and she has always known our family more clearly than I have been willing to. I didn't tell her everything in the text. I told her that something had happened with Derek and my account, and that I needed to talk to her when I was back from the conference. She responded in 11 minutes. She said, okay. She said, call me whenever you're ready. She said, I'm sorry, Cass. The way she said it, without asking what happened, told me something I filed away to think about later. The third thing I did was order room service, eat it at the desk, and finish preparing for my Friday morning session because I had worked 2 years to attend this conference, and I was not going to let Derek take that from me too. The Friday session went well. I drove back to Columbus Friday evening. I met with Margaret on Monday morning. What Margaret told me across her desk, with her reading glasses on and my documentation in front of her, was that the situation was more actionable than I might have expected. The emergency access I had granted my mother had been documented in the bank system with a notation describing its purpose, which was account management during medical emergencies or when I was unreachable. A transfer of $68,000 to a third party's business account did not fall within any reasonable interpretation of that purpose. The transfer had been made without my knowledge, without my consent, and under a form of access that had been obtained under a specific and limited set of circumstances. That, Margaret said, was misrepresentation of authorized access. That was grounds for a civil action. Derek, it turned out, had a history. Margaret had a contact in civil litigation who had encountered his name before, attached to a complaint from 2 years ago that had been settled quietly. One of his earlier investors had retained an attorney after losing a significant amount in the landscape business. The settlement had included a non-disclosure clause, which was why I had never heard about it. It had also, Margaret noted, done nothing to change his behavior. Over the following 2 weeks, with Margaret's guidance, I worked with the bank's fraud department and compiled documentation of the emergency access terms, the transfer records, and the communications I had with my mother in the hours immediately after. My mother's text messages in those hours, which I had screenshotted before anything else, were particularly useful. There were messages in which she described the transfer as a family decision. There were messages in which she confirmed she had been the one to initiate it. There were messages in which she said she was certain Derek would pay it back soon and that she had only done what any mother would do. Any mother would do. I read that message many times in those 2 weeks, not because it hurt me in the way I might have expected, but because of how clearly it told me something I had been half knowing my entire adult life. In my mother's understanding of the world, her children's resources were part of a family pool that she had authority over. My savings were not separate from the family. They were adjacent to it. They were available to it. My independence was permitted but not real. Not in the way that mattered. Not in the way that meant she couldn't reach in, if Derek needed it. Nadia called me on the second Saturday after I was back. I was sitting in my apartment with Margaret's folder open in front of me, going over the statement timeline for the third time. When I answered, Nadia was quiet for a moment the way she had been quiet in the text. Then she said, Cass, I need to tell you something. And I could hear that she had been holding it since I first reached out. She told me that 2 years ago, shortly after Derek's landscape business went under, our mother had called her with a similar request. Derek was in a difficult position. Nadia had a small savings account she had been building, not as substantial as mine, but real. Our mother had asked whether she could be added temporarily to Nadia's account to help manage some transfers while Derek sorted things out. Nadia had said yes at first, and then spent the next 3 days feeling wrong about it in a way she couldn't shake. She had quietly removed the access before anything was transferred. She had not told me because she had not wanted to alarm me and because she had hoped she was being paranoid. She said, I should have warned you. I'm so sorry, Cass. I've been sitting with that since you texted me. I put the folder down. I walked to my window and stood there for a moment, looking at the street below. There are moments in your life when something confirms itself, not with noise or explosion, but just with a quiet click of recognition, like a lock closing. This was one of those moments. My mother had run the same approach on both of us. She had gotten to Nadia first, and Nadia had escaped it. Then she had gotten to me. And the reason I had not been warned was the same reason I had not warned Nadia about a dozen other things over the years. Because in our family, you protected the people you loved by keeping the worst things quiet, by absorbing them privately, and hoping the distance would hold. I sat down on my kitchen floor. I cried for a while. Not about the money, not about Derek, not entirely about my mother. I cried because my sister had known and had not been able to tell me, and because I had lived in the same family with the same patterns for 29 years and still believed I had found a way to be safe in it. I cried because of the condo I had walked through twice, and the life I had been building so carefully, and the particular loneliness of realizing that your most careful plans are visible to people who do not see them as yours. Nadia drove to Columbus the following weekend. She brought food, and she sat on my couch, and she told me things she had been carrying for years, things she had seen, conversations she had overheard. The way Derek talked about my salary when I wasn't in the room. A comment my mother had made once about how I worked so hard I must have more than I knew what to do with. None of these things were the story by themselves. Together they made a picture. She gave me everything she remembered, and I added it to the folder, and I gave it to Margaret. The civil case took 5 months. Margaret filed on the grounds of fraud, unauthorized transfer under misrepresented authorization, and unjust enrichment. Derek's attorney was responsive at first, and then slow, and then silent for 3 weeks, and then responsive again, which Margaret told me was a pattern that meant they were assessing their exposure. The bank's fraud investigation produced documentation that supported the misrepresentation claim, specifically the mismatch between my stated authorization purpose and the nature of the transfer. The text messages from my mother were introduced as evidence of her role in initiating and facilitating the transfer. During those 5 months, my mother called me 14 times. I let all of them go to voicemail. The messages in the early weeks were explanatory, the versions of events organized to minimize what had happened. Then they shifted to emotional, which was harder. She said she missed me. She said she hoped I understood she had only been trying to help her son. She said she had raised me to be the strong one and she had made the mistake of leaning on that too hard, and she was sorry if it had come out wrong. She said if it had come out wrong. I listened to all of them. I did not call back. My father, who has been a quiet presence my entire life in the same way a slow leak is a quiet problem, left one message in the 3rd month. He said Derek was going through a very hard time. He said he hoped I could find it in my heart. He did not say anything about my $68,000. He said he hoped I could find it in my heart, which is a request, not an apology. Derek called once. He did not leave a voicemail. I will tell you what I found out about Derek's investment project, because it matters to the shape of the story. Through Margaret's process and through documentation that came out in discovery, it became clear that the private investment opportunity Derek had been describing to the family was not structured the way he had described it. He had collected money from 7 people over the course of nearly 3 years. 3 of them were family acquaintances. One of them was a man from his former church who was 71 years old. The funds were represented as going toward a stake in a logistics startup. The startup existed on paper and in a very polished presentation document, and not in any other form that Margaret's contact could verify. The money from my account had been used to satisfy a payment demand from 2 of those earlier investors who had started asking questions. I was the emergency valve, the next available resource when the pressure got too high. The civil case settled before it went to trial. Derek's attorney advised settlement once the full scope of the documentation was assembled. The settlement required full repayment of $68,440 plus legal costs, structured over a court-enforced timeline with a lien on Derek's assets to secure it. My mother was named as a co-respondent for her role in the transfer and received a civil judgment requiring her to acknowledge her participation in writing. There was also, separately, a complaint filed with the State Attorney General's office by 2 of Derek's other investors, which resulted in a criminal investigation that I was not a party to. I gave one statement to the investigating attorney, and then Margaret handled the rest. The last information I received was that Derek had entered a plea agreement on charges of securities fraud and theft by deception. He received 3 years of supervised probation, mandatory restitution to all affected parties, and a 10-year prohibition on soliciting investments or managing funds on behalf of others. I was not in the courtroom for any of it. I had taken enough days away from work. The first repayment installment arrived in my account on a Tuesday morning in March. I was at the hospital, mid-shift, when the balance alert came through. I looked at the notification, and then I put my phone back in my pocket and went to check on the patient in room 408 because she needed her medication adjusted, and the number in my account could wait until I had a moment to breathe. Later in the break room, I sat with a cup of coffee, and I let myself feel it for exactly as long as it took to drink that coffee. Then I went back to work. I want to tell you about the condo with the cream walls and the east-facing windows that I had walked through twice before any of this happened. I had put in an offer that was still pending when the money disappeared. When the bank froze my account during the investigation, the offer fell through. I had to call the realtor and explain enough of the situation to withdraw. She was kind about it. She said these things happen and that the right place would come up again. I thanked her, and I put that grief in the same place I put the other things, and I kept moving. 6 months after the settlement, when the full repayment was in place and the account was whole again, I found a different place. A two-bedroom on the fourth floor of a building in the Short North neighborhood with a small balcony and kitchen windows that face west and fill the apartment with orange light in the evenings. The condo with the cream walls had represented something I had wanted, which was the proof that I had made it far enough away that no one could reach me. This apartment was something different. It was what I actually wanted, which was a home that felt like me, that I had chosen with clear eyes and no timeline and no one else's emergency pressing in on the decision. Nadia helped me move in. She took a long weekend and drove from Pittsburgh with her car full of boxes I hadn't been able to fit in the moving van. We spent 2 days unpacking and talking about everything except our parents, and then on the second night we talked about them too, because that is how it goes in families like ours. You can go around the edges for a while, and then eventually the shape of the thing becomes the conversation. We didn't fix anything. We didn't resolve anything that could actually be resolved about two people who had spent our entire lives treating us as extensions of their own needs. We named it clearly and without softening it, and then we made dinner together and cleaned up and sat on the balcony in the dark for a while. That was enough. That was more than it had ever been. I still work the early rotations sometimes. I sign up for them voluntarily now, not because of a financial calculation, but because I have learned something about myself in the years of early mornings, which is that I do my best thinking before the rest of the world has fully arrived. The hospital at 5 a.m. is a different place than it is at noon. The hallways are quieter, and the light through the windows is still gray, and there is a kind of focus available in those hours that I have come to value. I am better at my job than I was 5 years ago. I am better at my life than I was 5 years ago. Not because things have been easier, but because I have stopped spending so much of myself trying to be acceptable to people who were never going to accept my boundaries in the first place. I kept the balance alert, the one that came through at 11:23 on a Thursday morning with the number that meant everything was gone. It is still in my notification history. I look at it sometimes, not often, but deliberately. I want to remember what it felt like to stand in that hallway and read the same number twice and understand it both times. I want to remember what I did next, which was finish my shift and then make exactly the right calls in exactly the right order. I want to remember that I did not wait to be rescued, and I did not collapse, and I did not let the people who took from me also take the part of myself that knows how to act clearly under pressure. People ask me whether I feel guilty, whether I think taking legal action against my own family went too far. I understand why they ask. It is a question I have asked myself, honestly and without the comfort of a predetermined answer. Here is what I have arrived at. Derek built a structure designed to collect money from people who trusted him, including people who loved him, and when it became unsustainable, he used my mother to access funds I had spent 5 years earning without her knowledge or mine. My mother took access I had given her for a specific and limited purpose and used it to move $68,000 to her son's account while I was working in another city. These were not accidents. They required timing and coordination and a specific belief about what kind of person I would be when I found out. I was supposed to be the kind of person who would absorb it, who would be angry for a while and then let family be family, who had always been the stable one and would stabilize again. I love my mother. I mean that without qualification and without performance. I love her the way you love something complicated, the way you love a thing that is true and painful in equal measure. I love Derek the way I love the memory of someone who became someone else, or maybe always was someone else, and I just took a long time to see it clearly. Love is not permission. It is not the same as allowing the people who hold it to use it as a passkey into the things you have built. Forgiveness is something I am working on, in the time and the pace and the manner that belongs to me, without it requiring me to call anyone back before I am ready or pretend that what happened was smaller than it was. Nadia came back for Thanksgiving. We cooked together in my kitchen with the west light coming through the windows, and she brought a small succulent in a terracotta pot as a housewarming gift, because she said I needed something alive in the apartment that I didn't have, to take care of every day. It's on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. I water it on Sundays. It is doing well. There is a version of this story that ends with me sad about the condo with the cream walls and the east-facing windows. I thought about that version for a while and decided it wasn't the true ending. The true ending is that I live in a place I chose without urgency, without anyone's emergency pressing in on the decision, with my sister's plant on the windowsill and a balcony where the light turns orange in the evenings. The true ending is that I know now, not theoretically, but in the way you know things that have been tested, that I am capable of being the person who acts clearly, when the stakes are real. If you are watching this and you recognize the shape of it, the family that has always treated your stability as a shared resource, the guilt that was handed to you before you were old enough to question it, the moment when you realize that someone you loved just made a calculation about whether you would be the kind of person to do something about it, I want you to hear this plainly. Protecting yourself is not a betrayal. Knowing the terms of every access you have ever given someone is not paranoia. Sitting in a parking garage in Cincinnati and making the right calls in the right order is not coldness. It is the most honest thing you will ever do for yourself, and it is something you are allowed to do without apologizing for it first. You are allowed to be the stable one and still refuse to be the floor someone else stands on. You are allowed to love your family and file the paperwork. And you are allowed to build something that belongs to you in every room, behind any door you choose, with your sister's plant on the windowsill and nobody else's name on the account. If any part of this stayed with you, I would genuinely love to know which part. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one, and if you know someone who needs to hear this today, please pass it along.